We can begin calling on Prime Minister here.
Hi, just give me a minute to get my timer. Okay. Is it okay if I turn on my camera?
Yep, that should be fine.
Okay. There is background noise because we're currently outside. If you like, you can't hear me, just flag me out in my speech, but I'll try to be like loud. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. There are no winners in war. For both those that have claimed victory and those that have lost, it is a visceral reminder of the friends and families that have died for a needless conflict that ought not to happen. Before I get onto my arguments, I'd like to frame out what exactly war memorials look like. Oftentimes, these are reminders of soldiers, for example, meant to perpetuate nationalism, meant to justify the existence of a military-industrial complex. We don't have statues for everyone. Oftentimes, it is key figures within the war by virtue of these memorials being centralized around war. So oftentimes, it's not like the EDSA memorial that preserves memories of protesters that died or were imprisoned during the EDSA revolution, but rather statues honoring Confederate generals and people that have figures that we have deemed to be integral to the war effort. Secondly, oftentimes it's established by certain people. It is governments. It is people in power that want to perpetuate a certain narrative by virtue of them putting money into these memorials. But thirdly, we think then the alternative on government is that there are other ways in which you can remember war without glorifying war and the people that participated in it. Things like museums, things like integrating it into the school curriculums, for example, we're perfectly fine with defending those. Two arguments then in this debate. The first is on how it glorifies war. 4 layers. The first is on oftentimes military figures are again at the center of war memorials for the reason that all the funding that goes into establishing these memorials stems from the fact that the people that prop these up are people with direct connections to the people that they are glorifying. It is new regimes that want to legitimize themselves within the state and therefore want to glorify them taking power. For example, it is organizations like Daughters of America whose fathers and grandfathers were Confederate generals that they want to be remembered well. But secondly, it is also that they tend to emphasize particular events within the conflict in order to forward a certain narrative that war is okay or that to some extent war is justified. It is the fact that these narratives are often sensationalized, like winning unbeatable battles, for example, or glorifying people that have won certain small conflicts within the greater conflict. It is the fact that the average person doesn't want to go to war by virtue that there's a natural aversion to things like death, things like violence, the fact that war is an inconvenience economically and politically. But the reason why war memorials become a countervailing narrative to this that make people predisposed towards war is because you put these memorials in the middle of the street and say that it's okay, say that it's justified by virtue of the fact that our national identity, for example, is built around the winning of this war and the completion of this conflict. But thirdly, we think that there's no accountability. So if opposition wants to say that, oh, we want victims to we want to remember war by for example because we want to honor victims or we want to create discourse around whether the conflict should or should not have happened, but there you can't create discourse because these memorials are often ingrained within the national identity. So holidays, for example, become tradition. You teach it in schools that these holidays are good and it's okay, and because of the way that it is framed as soldiers dying, because these narratives are so visceral, there's no feedback mechanism for people to talk against it, that oftentimes you can't create discourse. It's hard to protest against war memorials, to address like war crimes, for example, because of the fact that the state can say that, oh, you need to honor the people that have died. Oftentimes, the harms are irreversible. And this also intersects with other state interests, with, for example, giving reparations to victims, or like making it easier for veterans, for example, to live. Because on opposition side, on opposition side,
POI.
it can just say that, oh, it's okay because we have honored your ancestors, we don't need to give you money. Versus on our side, it shifts the burden to governments for actual reparations for the people that are victims of this conflict. But fourthly, I want to talk about the counterfactual. So if there's no war memorials, we're perfectly fine to defend things like museums, or again, integrating it into school curriculums. We treat it like any other part of history in that we don't attach narratives to it. So if there's no emphasis in war, if there's more opportunities for discourse, for example, in schools, you can discuss about whether or not these, like the war was justified, or if the things that we do to win the war are justified. In museums, you present facts to people and allow them to make conclusions from that based on their own opinions. It is we are perfectly fine to defend a counterfactual where there are like feedback mechanisms for people to engage in discourse about the war without them necessarily having to glorify certain individuals or glorify certain moments within the conflict. Before I go on to second argument, sure, POI.
So a lot of the things you give in your counterfactual are also prone to the same harm. So museums, for example, can emphasize specific events. If you're already a new regime which has so much control because you're authoritarian, you can have state propaganda to support war or support your efforts.
No. But a lot of these things, museums, curriculums, have to be held accountable by other actors that aren't within the state or aren't within these organizations. So it's not just that the state can control the entirety of the state, like the school curriculum, because like for the vast majority of these states, they are not authoritarian. It's not that they can prop up museums that only talk about why war is good. It's the fact that organizations, for example, like Daughters of America, can't control a lot of these things because they aren't attached to the state. But war memorials in particular are so pernicious because of the fact that they can be established by one particular actor wanting to forward one particular narrative, and over time they become so entrenched in state traditions that it becomes hard to counter them. Second argument then on how it worsens existing narratives and creates more opportunities for conflict. The first layer is that war memorials are there to leverage other narratives against people. So things like nationalism, because almost always it is there to justify certain things that the state or other actors do. It becomes the building block of our national identity, that we gained independence because of military might, and therefore conflict is okay. But secondly, it forces victims to relive trauma. You remind them each day when they pass a statue, or like each year when like a holiday happens, that these are their ancestors or these are their family members that died. You highlight divisions that were made decades back. The fact that there's so much like racism in Japanese and China relations, for example, even though like the conflict were happened generations back. You bring the bitter rivalries of the past to the present when it doesn't need to happen because like the social, political, and economic conditions of the time are different now. But because of the fact that you highlight war and you highlight conflict, you bring these conflicts back, and that is when we get more war and more divisions. For all those reasons, proposed.
Thank you so much for your speech. Calling on Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Hi, you're audible and visible.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll POS through chat, and then if by 5 I don't take, you can use it by voice. Okay. When society has broken down and lives have been lost, The only thing that we can do, and the best thing we can do for the people who have suffered, is to remember. To remember the sacrifices they have made for our people. To remember what they have really gone through to be able to create a better world. Whether it be, one, making lives for soldiers and the things that they get post-war better, but also, and more importantly, making society more sensitive to the world that victims have to deal with, to the fact that entire states and nations are victims of things like colonialism, like war, and we think that it's in their world, where when you forget, it's the world in which you no longer have accountability. You can no longer ask for reparations, and more importantly, you can no longer push for structural change for people like soldiers, like victims. The first thing I want to ask is, what are war memorials and what do they do? We would suggest that the main point of them is to educate and inform and help people remember. So, for example, in Vietnam, you have memorials that remember or remind people of things like Agent Orange. But second, we would suggest this is where you integrate memories of war in culture. So, for example, you have songs and tunes that allow people to sing about them outside of just the war memorial, like statues that you see. But third, we would suggest it exists in ingredients. So yes, there are songs, but it can also be entire holidays. It can also be things like museums, because museums are a collection of memorials in a building. So they cannot claim that as something that they have, because note that all their alternatives are also war memorials. Their burden is to regret the existence of all of them, not just the glorification of it. And that's why they have to lose this debate from the get-go, because they don't actually fulfill their burden, they skirt around it. Like, we would suggest, like, first and foremost, they don't explain how these alternatives that they suggest are not the same as what the state would do, if they already claim that the state has the incentive to try to suck the dick of people who have won. So we don't really know why it's therefore exclusive on their side. But again, museums are collections of memorials. They have to engage. Finally, then, we would suggest that wars can also include revolutions. For example, the Philippine-American War were attempts of Filipinos trying to free themselves from the colonialism that America brought onto our country. What this suggests is that God cannot regret only memorials for leaders' wars. They have to regret them all. The burden here is quite simple. If we are able to explain why these memorials are good in making sure that people get the kind of reparations that they need, but that states are held accountable, we have to win. First thing I want to do is engage. Why is it more likely to evoke sorrow over galvanizing war? I think first, it's human nature to be averse to war. Just because you see things like a full-on memorial doesn't mean that you're going to want to invade Syria, doesn't mean you're going to want to invade other countries. But second, most countries actually that have these memorials are small and colonized. What this suggests is, like, one, statistically more of these people have died and these countries have lost more. Look at Vietnam, for example. But two, that there are like generational people or stories that with places that need to have to talk to them. It doesn't matter how it's presented. These are all tied to the culture that people have lived by, and that is why it's likely to be accepted as more sorrow as opposed to galvanizing war. But a few more reasons after that. Third, most of these places are made post-conflict in the states. So you have reconstruction, which means you don't want war again, which is why governments will not intentionally want to galvanize war when they don't have any money to begin with or a society that they need to rebuild. But fourth, we would say that, like, absent it, you would actually make it it's likely that veterans who come back in our world, it's likely that veterans who come back would talk about it. And that's where you have governments who are going to be held most accountable to them, because these are the people who have protected things like the institution of democracy. But finally, there's a natural media incentive. You want people to relate to it. So you talk about suffering, you talk about what they lost in war, because war memorials become ingrained in culture and something that people look at and look to every single year if it's a holiday, but often look at in times of like the dates, the important dates that you have when they see these types of memorials. Three arguments then. First, why this is necessary for soldiers. And I want to frame at the top that states are very complex, so we don't really know how they're going to act. So what's most proximate and immediate is how we are able to help soldiers. So first level, why is the absence of memorials bad for them? One, typically after war, there's a negative perspective on soldiers. They are seen as violent, they're seen as oppressors, because many people who come home, oftentimes, many people who experience the harms of war and soldiers believe that soldiers are bad people. We would say, absent a counter narrative, a lot of these soldiers who had sacrificed a lot, who had lost a leg, for example, or lost like their entire platoon, are people who cannot find any solace or peace when they come home, even after a life of war. But second, they lack political capital. Most soldiers in developing countries were conscripted because there was literally no choice. And in many Western states, it is typically minorities who become soldiers because they have no capital to do anything else. What this suggests is they're very vulnerable people who don't have a lot when they come back home. But third, if the state doesn't have a push to to care for them, they won't, because they're a small minority of the number of people in society. And we would suggest without a cultural push for other people to care, it does not become a hot topic for votes. Why is it better on our side? One, in more memorials, you want to know more. So you search, you look for soldiers whose stories other people would never ever hear about, absolutely wanting to talk about it. But second, it's tied with culture, and so you view this culture as relevant to their history. So even if it's not the most economic sense, there is still a push to give something back, to give them like proper pension after wars, because that's what they deserve. But finally, in worst cases of glorification where we engage, one, it would still happen in countries that need more soldiers. For example, the US saying the having the "We Want You" campaign. But second, we would say that that is only a small minority of cases in comparison to the vast majority. The impact here is simple. It's easier for these soldiers to fight for what they deserve after war and have a better life after that, because they've already been so traumatized, because they are crucial. Second argument, war memorials are a powerful tool for formerly colonized states to have accountability. Note that Western states have power to control narratives because they have often won these wars. And it's bad for three reasons. One, the natural incentive to scapegoat. For example, the US justified like entering Vietnam because the children and women in Vietnam were allegedly harmed by communists, but that wasn't necessarily the case. But two, that they can lie about casualties. So for example, in the French conflict in Mali, they claimed that it was the other side that killed the most people, when in fact it was the other side whose soldiers died the most. But finally, that there's a natural incentive to hide history to keep credibility. So for example, we have US and France trying to say that they're great because they fight for NATO, but oftentimes that is only they hide history to be able to keep that credibility. The comparative in our world is simple. One, there's information out there that corrects it because these are proximate to your communities and you talk about them, and that is a prerequisite for the rest of the world talking about it. Because if the Vietnamese people are not talking about their what they've gone through, the rest of the world will never know about the Vietnam War in the extent of which we know it now. But second, stories are additive, so maybe they won't believe just Vietnam, but now you have many other actors in the world talking about how the US has colonized them, talking about how they have been oppressed. And that's where you can additively hold the US, for example, accountable. But finally, on the media incentives to enter, when you point out information by victors that are wrong, there's an incentive for war journalists to come in to talk about these stories, which you cannot get in their world.
Thank you so much for your speech. Calling on Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, can I check if I'm both audible and visible?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Okay, thank you so much. Few eyes to the chat, please. I'll try to take one in between issues. All right. Speech start in 3, 2, 1. It is one thing to remember. It's another thing to be stuck in the past and continue the suffering that should be left under the dust. There are two things I'll do in this speech. The first is I'll explain why individual soldiers were further harmed on opposition bench in a world where war memorials oftentimes glorify suffering and glorify self-sacrifice at all costs. The second thing is on the defense of counterfactual and why it would have actually been better if we didn't have memorials specifically propped up on the idea of war and on the idea of victimhood. Before that, three things that I want to just highlight in terms of the strategy coming from government. The first thing is note how on weighing, I don't think opposition is able to explain how they are able to meaningfully help the victims, insofar as these harms have already been incurred, and just tangibly, we're not sure how we're able to provide reparations. Therefore, we think that we have to care more about preventing future victims or people in the present being harmed. And that happens when we don't prop militaries because they are glorified with the use of war memorials. That happens when we don't create strife that because of the highlighting of suffering that happens in between two groups of people, even if the aggression has happened generations before. That is the clear impact that we're claiming coming from government bench. The second call out I want to make that opposition claims that states can often hide casualties and can misuse information. Note how this is a harm that is symmetric on both sides, because on their side, states like what we explained that happens in states where they highlight soldiers and they highlight particular icons, for example, wars and like conflicts where they have won, or conversely where they have suffered the most, are the ones that are likely to be highlighted in war memorials. But secondly, note how a lot of their benefits of people being able to empathize with each other and to actually empathize with the rival is reliant on people going to the war memorials of the opposing side. Whereas on our side of the house, all you have to believe is just inherently all war memorials are ones that tend to disproportionately victimize a certain group of people, or on the flip side of that, tend to demonize the enemy. And our harms of the fact that people tend to be more supportive of militaries because it is highlighted as the best way to build a nation, as the fact that there are certain individuals that we have to exclude because they have caused so much harm to us, is something that you have to believe in this house. The last thing then I want to just highlight is, I think opposition's own context work against them. If we are operating in states where there were massive violence that has occurred, where people have been victimized to the large extent, that means that they don't prove their burden, which is why do we have to have an additional piece of memorabilia that causes them to remember. Because all of these things will probably make you remember, right? If it's a recent war, obviously it's recent memory that you have members of the family that need help, that need social welfare, and you will vote on states on that. What they don't answer is why the existence of memorials means that this is something that has to live in the long term. That even when the people who have participated in the war are 6 feet below the ground, it is their children that have to carry on this trauma and also the strife that has existed in their predecessors. The first issue then is why individual soldiers are actually harmed with the existence of war memorials. Before that, POI.
So just on aggregate, there are more countries that were harmed by things like colonialism, harmed by Western invasion, as opposed to Western countries that are promoting war, which they can probably do on both sides regardless. So what is actually the margin of change you're proposing?
Yeah, the margin of change is when countries like the Philippine government do not invest in more of the military and instead put it in nation building, put it in building the economy. Because you now can no longer say that the way in which we protect our country is by being the military so that we are not invaded by the West again. It is through building jobs, through building schools, and to making sure that people of tomorrow have a job, have food on the table, and have an education that they can have a future into. The first issue then is why individual soldiers are actually further victimized on opposition bench. The first thing I want to reject is that idea that soldiers often get help. The problem with war memorials is oftentimes they emphasize death and sacrifice. Note that for you to get in a war memorial, you first have to die. And what this means is that for the soldiers who come back to the country, oftentimes, not only do they still face the stigmatization of having PTSD and being deformed, because that is still going to be existent on both sides. But now they have the additional guilt that they should have died. They have survivor's guilt because they should have been with their comrades, because they were that is how they were best able to honor the country. The counterfactual on our side is that even if we can't assure that these people will not be discriminated, and by the logic of opposition, oftentimes these people are often conscripted or they're still part of the discriminated group. We're not sure if we're able to resolve discrimination, but at least we don't give them the additional guilt, because war memorials are ones that remind them that they failed to their duty of their soldier just because they've survived. But secondly, war memorials justify the existence of soldiers. It's the fact that war memorials, with the rhetoric of opposition, oftentimes glorify war as the means to you to build and protect a country. It is true, but opposition, and this is where I flip the POI, most of the times, Western countries will not go out of their way in the current status quo to invade developing nations. But the problem is that developing nations are geared towards things like militarization, are geared toward things such as putting a lot of their economy into war memorials and to furthering their military complexes. Even if, as Nessie explained to you, they don't have much money, and that money could have gone to things like welfare, could have gone to things like food on the table. And the reason why the average person is not able to vote for these particular things is because they are fed with the narrative that war is necessary. You don't want to end up like the people who have died, and that's why it's important for us to prepare such that that doesn't happen to us again. The second issue then is on the defense of the counterfactual, and why exactly just putting this in mere museums and education curriculums particularly enough. The first is because oftentimes we don't institutionalize particular narratives. It is much more stringent because museums and historical curricula have to uphold being objective. It's a fact that they have to cover other topics. It's a fact that they have to stick to the facts and to stick into the numbers and to provide those means. That is not existent in a war memorial, because war memorials specifically prop up stories but not facts. The second thing is that the counterfactual of historical curriculum and museums are oftentimes much more open to criticism. It's because we have to update this every now and then. But war memorials particularly don't, because they're there to picture particular periods, capture a particular period of history, and that oftentimes is the central or the highlight of war. At the end of this speech, we are able to do two particular things. The first is we were able to explain why war memorials oftentimes prop more violence and more militarization. The second thing is we explained that even in the worst case that we aren't able to take care of soldiers, at the very least, we don't shame them for not dying. For all those reasons and more, we're very proud to propose things.
Thank you so much for your speech. Calling on Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay. I presume I'm audible and visible. Yeah. We'll take POI and chat. We'll take you around 5. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 contributions from the Gelo, but broadly, I just want to point out that it is unclear what specifically the counterfactual is on government. If they say it is memorials that they want for, or museums that they want, and education about the particular wars, I am not sure what the line is for their side of the house. It's more likely than not, actually, if they say it is, propaganda from states that are oppressive, for these to be the most pervasive mechanisms for them to do it on their side of the house. If they do not want people to remember, I don't know why they have museums. It's counterintuitive to the literal entire case that they give, even from the second speaker, that's largely unresponsive to what we give to you on our side of the house. I'll have 2 contributions, and then lastly, I'll just weigh why specifically all the stuff on soldiers and all the stuff on the most vulnerable people should outweigh win this debate. Firstly, then, why is it, and winning the characterization debate, why is it that they're more likely to honor the vulnerable in memorials on aggregate than it to be used by oppressors on either side of the house? There are reasons why they give for why it's specifically going to benefit the oppressors are at best very, very flimsy. They give you 2 reasons. Firstly, they say there's state propaganda as a mechanism for state propaganda to enshrine the way in which people may remember this, and they're more likely, for example, use it to uplift themselves and particular administrations as being good. 1, this is empirically not true. Most often they can default to other things, such as, for example, easier, less risky mechanisms like disinformation campaigns, like just shutting people up and paying historians, etc., talk about other kinds of things as well. They don't prove why specifically this is the biggest tool in the toolbox for them to have this. I'm sure they could do other forms of propaganda, but 2, I'm not sure why they would want to do it. Because again, a lot of these memorials are ways for which people who were actually within those wars talk about their conflict. So again, this is ways for them to diminish their power and to not have control of the narrative. So I'm not sure why they would do that. Secondly, they say it's a way for to socialize people into being okay with conflict. And their mechanism is that their analysis is you see it every single day. It's visceral and ingrained as part of your life, for example. Therefore, the end analysis is you're going to be okay with war. Literally, they don't prove the end link. 1, if it's the case, it's so visceral and so ingrained, you see it every day and you see so many people that died. Could have been you, could have been your ancestors, for example. If it weren't for them sacrificing, it could have been you. I am not sure why you're going to be like, kumbaya, I love war, I want to engage in war. At best, 1, you're more likely to think this is a bad thing. It was actively fruitless for your country and thus be against it in the future. But 2, it makes it more likely, for example, that you are, for example, glorify or against glorifying these things, but more specifically empathize with people who were actually victims, like people who were conscripted within these conflicts. So again, both of these reasons are flimsy. I will prove why specifically, structurally, these memorials are likely to honor the vulnerable on either side of our side of the house. 3 reasons for this. Firstly, as what we proved to Neri to a large response, veterans and descendants of these veterans who were in these conflicts have incredible cultural and discursive power to accurately represent their conflict, especially because if it's what they claim that's so important within that natural culture, they give them the opportunity regularly to check against governments if they want to, for example, use that war memorial to prop themselves up. Use a particular war to say, we are the descendants of those heroes from those wars, etc. And we are the people that ought to be enshrined and ought to be listened to all the time. It is the way for which these veterans, for example, to say, no, this conflict was so bad, this conflict was so terrible because I lost a leg, I lost a friend, I lost an arm, for example, in this conflict. And thus they have our ability to check against the corruption and against the authoritarianism that they say will happen on their side of the house because we have this discourse. Secondly, war memorials themselves are more likely to be managed by people that have been genuinely harmed. They say the US is just going to do this, or Western powers. One, the US or Western powers will do propaganda anyways. They don't prove why specifically this is the mechanism that they massively do this and the only way which they can massively change people's minds about war, etc. But two, I am just not sure this is the most of the cases. We proved to you from a POI, from a large part of the analysis from Nessie, that often it's things like, for example, Vietnam, that Vietnam soldier groups that run memorials within their own countries to tell people about what they experienced in the war. It's countries in LATAM, for example, and social groups that manage particular memorials. Note their mechanism literally goes against them. If they say it traumatizes you, it's so bad for you, yet there are still people that run these memorial museums. There's still people that care about these things to run them in the first place, even if it's so traumatizing. Guess what? That's why they're so important, because they're so important to them that they're willing to risk, for example, being lambasted by the media, etc., because they still want to portray their own like a narrative of the conflict as being bad, for example. That's why these Vietnam memorial museums exist, even despite the fact that the CIA, that other things, for example, like the Western media, actively go against them all the time. They still exist because they are important enough to talk about. But third, if they say viscerality, viscerality makes people on aggregate feel, they feel, for example, against conflict because it's so bodily, like against the way in which you, for example, conceive yourself as a human being. To see yourself as die in conflict, for example, is so inconceivable. And it could have been you, any particular person in your life, it could have been you. So what does this do for their side of the house in terms of you evaluating these arguments for these three results? One, they cannot run reparations as a way for them to say, we're just going to call out war, etc., because they do not prove why it's compelling. Under our side of the house, it is compelling because it's the vulnerable that have the chance to speak about their conflict in a nuanced way. When you give them this regular opportunity to do so because they have this discursive power. On their side of the house, they are washed out by the governments that they say are oppressive. Under our side of the house, there's a natural check-back mechanism, which means we have things like reparations and change under our side of the house. But secondly, it's just better for the people that actually suffered in these instances to talk about these things, to, for example, express their concerns, etc. They say it's re-traumatizing. For many of these people, they still do it anyways because it's part of their healing. It's part of the way in which we tell the world that this is what happened to us and it's important to talk about it. Before I go on to why specifically conflict is lessened, I'll go on to a PYM.
Yeah, so I don't think you're able to structurally prove why the vast majority of people that are able to build war memorials are those who happen to be very poor, don't have the resources, and are currently discriminated and marginalized.
So I give you examples. You have to, for example, prove on reasons why it's only going to be the West, etc. I prove to you specifically your mechanism works against you. Because if it's traumatizing and you have to manage these things every single year, it's likely going to be the people that need a reason for it to, for example, be managed in the first place. These are the people that actively care about it and actively care to hold that memory into the future. These are the people that most likely, for example, are the vulnerable people who are, at the back end of the conflict, etc. Secondly, then, we prove to you why conflict doesn't happen. They say this is about the long term. We win on the long term. Why? One, if multiple different countries have war memorials against the US, it is additive. It talks about the collective trauma that many countries in LATAM, etc., experience from things like colonization, etc., and just in general taking over the governments, which is additive. That's why, for example, everyone sees the US as imperialist right now, because many of these war memorials talk about a shared narrative. But two, it's about historical memory. Current politicians have to justify why wars happen precisely because we have war memorials every single year, for example. Both of these things are just unresponded mechanisms. For them to say less conflict happens, they have to prove why less conflict happens under their side of the house, and they simply do not do it. For those two reasons, then, very, very proud to propose.
Thank you so much for your speech. Calling on government whip. You're here.
Hi, give me a few seconds. I'll just restart my timer. Okay. Hi, I'm GovWhip. I'll be taking POIs in chat. Also, if the music is too loud, please let me know. I'll try my best to be as loud as possible. Starting in 3, 2, one. There are two clarifications I want to put at the top of my speech. The first thing I want to note is that this is a this house regrets motion. At no point has opposition proved as to why these benefits for soldiers, these pensions for mothers, all of these benefits that they want to talk about are already present in status quo. We explain from Chelsea to a great extent that oftentimes war memorials don't really put up incentives for individuals to fight for reparations, to feel validated and to feel solace. Because one, wars will still be glorified. Two, soldiers are still not given pension no matter how many statues you put up for them. Or three, the US war machine is still ongoing. So they don't necessarily prove as to why all of the benefits that they tell you from Neri to Gelo stand insofar as the way individuals interpret like war memorials in themselves already serves as reparations in themselves. So soldiers won't ask for money because there's a soldier statue placed upon the city hall, right? That's not how it works in status quo. It's oftentimes that the narratives that soldiers are good, whether or not they're able to help them tangibly, still stand on our side of the house. They don't necessarily get a reprieve to that. But the second thing I want to talk about is that propaganda will still exist either way. What changes and what's not symmetric on our side of the house is the extent to which states are able to pump out propaganda on our side of the house. Note, it's easier to pump out propaganda when the only thing you have to do is to literally, make a certain statue or make a certain holiday glorifying an individual. On our comparison, even if museums have the capacity to put out propaganda, it's the fact that there's state incentive for them not to be authoritarianistic. There's state incentive for individuals, since there's a huge voter base, for them to be appealing to. So it's way easier on their side of the house to put up propaganda because it's just a literal statue. It's a literal memorial day that most individuals can't question. But on our side, if it's the literal education system, if it's literal museums where so many individuals have to scrutinize it, we argue that the margin for propaganda to exist on our side of the house is less in comparison to opposition bench. There are two issues I want to tackle in this debate. The first is what happens to individuals post-conflict, and the second is where are states better off in our counterfactual or in their world. First issue, what happens to individuals post-war? The government push was clear. It was to say that this, on our side, it's seen as an issue absent the valorization of war. So it's the fact that oftentimes war memorials glorify soldiers. On our counterfactual, it's seen as an issue that most individuals have to learn about, absent the fact that these soldiers are glorified on their side of the house. The opposition response was to say that no, this is still needed insofar as you have or you need reparations because you need to emphasize the sorrow that these soldiers face. I want you to weigh this issue on, just gut check this, right? The first thing I want to note is that the tipping point for individuals to feel solace or to be reparated is if these conflicts don't serve as a grim reminder for them every day. So no, don't believe Gelo when they say that most of these victims are represented in these war memorials. It's oftentimes individuals who have the resources to put up these memorials, or individuals who want to forward certain narratives that they don't necessarily address on their side of the house. But the second thing I'd like to posit is that these are actually more proximate benefits on our side, especially when the education curriculum is incredibly huge, it's incredibly wide, so there's obviously a state incentive for them to better it. There's a state incentive to them just not go on full propaganda mode and feed individuals really bad education. The third thing I want to point out is that the vulnerable usually don't have the resources to often prop up these memorial dates. So it's the fact that most individuals who are vulnerable in the conflict in themselves, post-conflict, don't get to feel a sense of reparation because there's a statue placed upon the city hall, right? They don't necessarily prove this benefit. But two, they don't also guarantee reparations, because it doesn't mean to say that if you put up a memorial day, if you put up a statue, that the propensity for the state to give you reparations is going to be there, especially when Alex already explains that in status quo, and it is what has happened, and this is at the HR motion, that most individuals aren't treated right. It's only the fact that the victors are valorized. At the end of this issue, I've proven to you one clear thing. The individuals that they ought to protect in opposition don't necessarily feel solace, especially when the victors usually have the upper hand when placing memorials. Therefore, reparations do not exist on their side of the house. Second issue, but before that, Pioy.
So what is Gov's stance? Do they think that most of the soldiers are evil and that they ought only give reparations for the victims of these soldiers, or that some of these soldiers were indeed conscripted and they were indeed vulnerable people?
Okay, so if they're evil, then obviously we won't be glorifying it. But obviously, if there are these, the marginal amount of soldiers that do get victimized and they're soldiers soldiers, when coming home, are victimized and still continue to live, will still be benefited. So either way, if soldiers are good or if soldiers are bad, you don't necessarily prove a counter to that. Second issue, where are states better off? And I think I want to make this very, very clear, right? On their side of the house, war is glorified. Most individuals who are averse to war will be more predisposed to it, given the fact that it's bronze statues, given the fact that it's memorial days that oftentimes the states try to valorize on their side of the house. On our side, since it's just education curriculum, since it's just museums that often place like the burden for the state to make sure that these are facts and not just stories that are, these are facts and not stories that are mirrored into these memorial days, we argue that it was better. How do you ought to weigh this issue? Two things. The first is on accountability. Obviously, on their side of the house, the propensity for individuals to find accountability, to make sure that the state actually puts up the right individuals to be placed on these bronze statues is way less in comparison to the propensity for you to be able to question the educational system. But the second thing I want to point out is on state narratives, right? And this is the issue that they don't engage with at all. It's the fact that most individuals, when they are subjected to such glorified pieces of war, when individuals are subjected to the good things and are subjected to the worst forms of harm that individuals have gone through, is the fact that state narratives would still continue to exist. The fact that nationalist incentives that they don't necessarily prove to mitigate on their side of the house would still exist. They don't necessarily give all of the reparations that they have, and they don't necessarily prove as to why this is better on their side of the house. At the end of this issue, again, it's clear war will be continued to be glorified on their side of the house, especially when it's just easy to pump out so many of these war memorials without state control and without the individuals wanting to scrutinize it. But the second thing I'd like to point out is that oftentimes most individuals who are able to be benefited on their side of the house are the individuals who have succeeded, the individuals who have guaranteed victory in this war. They don't necessarily prove as to why that is a good benefit. Even at their best case, they already fall. All of this being said, proud to propose. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your speech. Calling on opposition whip here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yeah, you're audible and visible.
Thank you. I'll take POS in the chat, please. Okay. War has victors, but they aren't seen as victors because they are rewarded with the privilege to rewrite history. That it is justified to invade Vietnam because of the communist threat. That it's justified to invade Mali, even if you were the one that caused the Libyan crisis and caused the Libyan freedom fighters to go there. The problem is that in their side, there is no counterbalance narrative that calls out these actors that rewrite history. And that is the harm that up till 3 speakers, they are unable to address. The first thing I want to prove at the top of my speech is why government does not have a coherent counterfactual, and any benefit they claim is already dubious as a result of that. They say education and museums is their counterfactual, but one, the body that holds the state, that holds education accountable, is state-owned, by the way. So I'm unsure as to why, if you really have that terrible incentive as a state, you would still there'd be an objective nature to education. But secondly, I think if it is true that you want to cater to as much people as possible, then presumably there also is an equal state incentive to make Memorial Day as educational. In fact, the brainwashing that happens in education is far, far worse. As they see from the previous speaker, you are forced to sit in that class. As opposed to Memorial Day, maybe you can't criticize it, but you can choose not to attend it, you can choose not to celebrate it, etc. All those prove that the harms they impose under our side are far worse under theirs. Let's talk about the first issue on the welfare of soldiers. They say we don't have any present examples. The majority of the reparations that the US gave to Vietnam was distributed among its soldiers. The US has one of the biggest, highest veteran funds that is beneficial for workers. The UK state services that favor, for example, there's priority for healthcare for wounded soldiers. All of these prove that there is substantial reform. But even if you believe that isn't sufficient, it's about extents, right? Yes, we can maybe win on not that big of an impact, but if they prove aside they don't get any sort of sovereignty for soldiers at all, then they clearly lose this issue. And we highlight from the very start why this issue is so important. It's about lots of people that were forced to conscript, vulnerable actors like the poor or minority, which in most countries make up majority of the military. And it's the clearest moral margin of debate, margin of change in the debate, right? Because maybe you're unsure as to whether or not state narratives fall into our side or theirs. But what is clear is you view soldiers as human. You don't view them as killing machines, and therefore you should ostracize them for society. So at the very least, you have that under our side the solvency or the catharsis for vulnerable actors. The government material we hear in response is one, it is bad because it emphasizes sacrifice. First, if it emphasizes their sacrifice, that proves as to why they're deserving of more reparation than, for example, the average person. So I think that's necessarily good. But the second thing is that the average person does not know how bad war is. So that is that they don't treat soldiers with sensitivity. So for example, you do not know what PTSD is because you don't have war memorials where you see active stories of soldiers that suffer through PTSD. So when someone has a panic attack, you're lucky to ostracize them. You're lucky to bully them because they're weird, as opposed to giving them help or making sure that healthcare, so for example, to cope over PTSD is something that's accessible. The second thing they give is on this weird push on survivor's guilt, which is notably dropped at WIP. The first thing I want to point out here is that you probably feel this on both sides because admittedly on both sides, you saw your comrades die in front of you and you're unable to do anything. The difference is that you have rehabilitation under our side to get over that survivor's guilt to make sure that you don't harm yourself in the absolute worst case. But secondly, I actually argue that when people thank you, when you see people smiling because of the fact that you feel somewhat respected in your society, then it makes you cope over survivor's guilt because it makes you, for example, feel more justified or vindicated about the amount of sacrifice that you have given. The second issue then is on the narratives on war. The first thing I want to deal with is this catharsis or trauma claim. I just want to point out there's a tension. They say you have museums and education, which will probably still talk about the viscerality of war. So I'm unsure why they get any form of catharsis or the lack of trauma under their side. But let's engage with this. I actually think that victims have trauma regardless because they obviously went through it and probably they resonate heavily with what their grandmother told them about the war, etc. What the difference is, however, is two things. One, it's the ability to talk about it openly and being met with sensitivity. It is that you have access to better catharsis under our side because you can talk about these stories without being antagonized. You have people that are willing to listen to you, etc., and not willing to discredit you. But moreover, people know how you feel. They can empathize with your trauma, etc. You find communities from that because now all victims are open to talk about it. But the second thing is that I actually think that the trauma is not necessarily about yourself, but it's in fact about other people. For example, you feel trauma because your loved one who died in the hands of an American soldier their story was forgotten. Under our side, you get catharsis knowing that other people in your life were able to get their stories represented. So I actually think it's a better off comparative as opposed to their side. But here's the flip. Trauma gets far, far worse under theirs because you feel guilt about the fact that you may have participated in war, even if you didn't have a choice. You feel othered or you feel so different from everyone else in society, and you feel like no one at all respects your trauma, etc. So in fact, you feel more isolated and you're unlikely to ask for help in the case where it gets really bad. The second thing I want to talk about is on justifying conflict. The first thing I want to point out is there are other reasons to have conflict. Like the increase in military budget in the Philippines is not due to American colonization, it's due to border skirmishes with China, which happens in the modern day society. So I'm unsure why this is the tipping point. But more importantly, if states want to do it, it will happen regardless. Like control over state propaganda, like education. They say at second speaker that it's a liberal democracy and therefore you're unlikely to enter war. That means that under our side, their harm is mitigated. Because if you're a liberal democracy, then the average person can challenge these narratives and, for example, say that the state is lying about how many people they killed or the reason for their intervention. So actually, under their side, under our side, you get far more accountability when these things are more open discussions where everyone can participate in. But also, I just want to point out, at second speaker, they say Western countries will not invest anyways. The military budget of the US is unknown to the average population. So I'm unsure as to why the average person without a memorial date, without specifically highlighting all of the terrible things the American army has done, you're unlikely to get any form of accountability in regards to these under-table discussions. I'll take up POI now.
Yeah, so the problem with your case is that you don't help individual soldiers. You glorify soldiers as a whole and as an industry, but soldiers still don't have reparations in the status quo. When they go home and they get PTSD and they're violent towards other people, they're still ostracized and people aren't sensitive.
The first thing I want to point out here is that you don't really prove that. Presumably, if you glorify them, you allow the average person to relate to their struggles, to have more sympathy for their struggles, and therefore more impetus to ask, for example, a veterans fund that would typically, as you say, cut from welfare, which the average person is unable to support under your side because they don't think that there's a valid cause to do so. On the narratives, on the second point on highlighting divisions, the first thing I want to point is that this is really nonsensical. Like war had a lot of participation, like revolutions were often engaged with nationwide, and people were equally harmed by, for example, things like colonialism or conflict. The important thing here is the converse, that oftentimes, if you did not highlight, for example, a unified struggle, you default to cultural or class differences, which are often alienating. The divide and conquer techniques that colonial colonialists did on you often mean that you view, for example, other ethnicities as others. So generally, you have more conflict and more tension on their side. Because on our side, states can instrumentalize a particular narrative that's often unifying. But absolutely, let's talk about the realistic context. Because this team did not want to engage with 90% of the debate, which is that countries that were colonized now have the ability to check and balance states and their information and their hegemony over information. At least on our side, Vietnam did get reparations, even if it was little. It's better than none at all that exists on government side. For those reasons, stand with opposition.
Thank you so much for your speech. Calling on opposition reply. Here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Okay, perfect. This team likes to leverage that this debate is retrospective, but never actually engage in it. They never explain to us, most importantly, what the world would have looked like absent these kinds of war memorials, and why specifically that is good. In fact, when they talk about the fact that reparations are not enough, we still have at least some degree of reparations, and they don't explain to us, one, why you can maintain that in a world absent these kinds of things, but two, why it is comparatively better. That is why they lose, because they don't really explain to us what the true margin of change is in their world, other than to say that our world is bad. The question is, why is it comparatively worse? We would suggest it is their world, that one is far worse for soldiers in the world in which you don't have the cultural push to care about them, but secondly, and more importantly, a world in which you do not treat these people who are traumatized, who have lived through war, who have seen their comrades die, live in peace. So the first thing I want to do, therefore, is question which world really achieves less war and better reparations. And let's talk about war first, because their entire case is that these stories galvanize war and teach that war is necessary. The first thing I want to point out is that they concede at deputy that the vast majority of Western states don't currently want to go to war. Note that right now it is a world in which you have war memorials. What this means is that, one, this relies on an example of a world in which war memorials exist, that the US does not want to go to war, so like that, even if those Confederate daughters that they explain exist, which already shows to us specifically why that therefore does not lead to things like war. But second, it kills their already very shaky mech for why war memorials will be designed by states to galvanize war, because they themselves say that states don't want war, which means that their entire mechanism to explain why people will be warmongering people no longer stands by design of their own case. But the second thing I want to point out is that they never actually explain why these memorials are the tipping point for war, because many other things are far more proximate: populist leaders, threats of war from aggressive states, border skirmishes, and economic conquest. So even if you believe them, even if they are correct that it may galvanize war, this is just a drop in a bucket and actually makes no meaningful change to the feeling that people might want to have war, because there are other things that are far more proximate in comparison to something that happened 50 to 100 years ago. So war, dead. Let's talk about reparations then. Notably, there's no response from DEP or WIP to talk about why they're able to get reparations or respond to our own idea of reparations, other than to say it's not enough. While if it is true that it's not enough, the question then becomes, how on their side do they even get it in the first place? Because what we explain is that it becomes a cultural push for people to care, when otherwise they would not have known, because the vast majority of people in the states that they talk about, like the US, did not experience war themselves. So that's why they already lose. But why is reparations so important? One, US is just one country versus the dozens of others that were colonized, and therefore need to galvanize around these kinds of stories to be able to push for reparations. Like the very reason why Vietnam was able to get some level of reparation was because they remembered and cared enough to bring forth a complaint to the UN. They have to prove why these still exist in their world. They did not, and so they lose on welfare, both for countries that have been harmed, but also for soldiers that we explain are able to push for their rights because they have people who care. Finally, on messaging, they say that they don't want people to be forced to remember, but they rely on museums and they rely on education curriculums where people will be required to hear about women in their states being raped, about their families being killed. They say that states will misconstrue it, but defend the most out-of-touch pro-elite alternatives that they assert states won't control, like education and like museums. What really is the world we paint in messaging that they ignore? It happens on 6 levels. 1, in memorials constructed by states who have been colonized. 2, in memorials made to remember people who have died for thoughtless wars. 3, in the integration of this in cultural narratives that push people to engage in discourse and care about soldiers. 4, in the motivation to seek out and talk to soldiers who are actually there and can therefore either contextualize or even challenge the ways that states build memorials. And that is a corrective mechanism to their problem that we are able to provide that they don't have any solvency for. 5, in the collective stories of dozens of countries who have been colonized by the same oppressor and can now push for it. But finally, in communities who will treat their war veteran with kindness, because you get the average person who hasn't experienced war themselves to care.
Thank you so much for your speech. Calling on government reply. Here.
Memorial. Okay. Hi, last check, audible and visible.
Hi, you're audible and visible.
Thank you. Speech start in 3, 2, 1. 3 points that I want to take note at the top of the speech. The first is they accuse us that we don't know the line, but we've explained what the line was. It's the fact that historical curriculum in museums, 1, cannot inherently emphasize because they have to talk about other topics. 2, have a higher burden of being more objective because that is the nature of these aspects. Compare this to memorials that inherently are there to highlight particular aspects of war. That's why it's called a war memorials. But secondly, states can blatantly skew the narrative, and that's all right because that's what's expected in a war memorial. But it's the fact that when they do this in educational curricula and historical curricula, they are accused of being propagandists, and it's the fact that it costs them democratic voters. The second thing is, I think that opposition team relies on examples versus reasons. They give examples as to why it's the vulnerable and marginalized, but they don't give the reasons as to why it's often the vulnerable and the marginalized that can prop up war memorials, when we explain that oftentimes it's military icons that get to benefit from this the most, that it's often pro-military interest groups that are able to forward particular aspects of war that we often regret in the vast majority of cases. But even if it happens to be victims, we also engage on that front, which I'll explain later. The last thing is, I think that opposition misses the nuance as to what war memorials particularly do, because it's not enough for them to say that we need to make people care about the war. Look at the rhetoric. People are sensitive because it's a lived experience. So it's the fact that large masses of people were conscripted. It's the fact that you are likely to have a brother or father that was sent into that war. And therefore, after that war, you probably care about voting issues about veteran benefits and retirement funds. What they had to argue was why, when years has passed, these people are 6 feet under the ground. These people the people that are currently walking in this earth do not live in the traumatic rivalries of their predecessors. Why remind them of this bitter rivalry and not allow them to heal and move forward? That is the nuance that opposition particularly misses, and that's why that cost them the debate. The first issue then is on whether or not we help individual soldiers. The first thing I want to highlight is how they miss the nuance of what memorials particularly emphasize, which is sacrifice and death. And that's why it's just untrue that that soldiers who go back from war are ones that are benefited. We said that they're still further shamed because things that they are stigmatized for, such as them being disabled or them having PTSD, are still prevalent societal norms. But now they have the additional shame of not dying with their comrades, and that's why they are not in the war memorial, but their comrades are. The second thing is we explained that the state can be tokenistic. They can claim that we already honored your victims, which is the argument that opposition provided, by the way, and that is why people can't get further accountability and further help, because the war memorials already serve as reparations that they've already consumed. That is how we win as to how you help individual soldiers. Note how this is important, because we're not reliant on the benefits of getting more reparations for individual soldiers. You also just have to believe that if on our paradigm or counterfactual is not one that further shames and stigmatizes soldiers for merely surviving a traumatic experience, we already win this debate. The second thing is in society, and note how our side was not just reliant as to whether or not we get increased war or decreased war. The first thing that we claim that this was a massive use of state resources. It's the fact that assuming that this is used to prop up victims, this is money that could have gone to welfare, this is money that could have gone to the economy and building livelihoods. So they said that Western states are able to get away with like being able to give veterans benefits, but the vast majority of developing states have to pick between funding the military or funding the economy. We would rather that they choose the economy. The second thing is that we've explained that national identity becomes built on the military and militarization, because if you literally told people that the way in which you protected national identity and security is by sacrifice and through the military, obviously that is more incentive. They just symmetricize this as whip, but they have to respond to the reasons that this is a debate about extents. The last thing is that you have institutionalized trauma. It's the fact that this is rivalries that happened in the past, wars of people that don't live now but have lived in generations before, and that means trauma and discrimination that we pass at the present. For all those reasons and more, we are very proud to propose things.
Cool. Thank you so much. Debaters can cross the house. I have 10 minutes, so I'll be back in around 10 minutes. But yes, congrats.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Boggers. Boggers.